I wanted to stop for a second and just remind all of the all of the people who are on this webinar to put your questions in the chat box. Please do not use the Q&A, use the chat box instead. We're going to go into our panel discussion now, and I have questions targeted for each one of our wonderful presenters here. And we're going to start with William Serrata. And my question for you, William, is, from your perspective as a community college president, what are the most pressing funding issues that you face?
No, certainly appreciate it and have really enjoyed the panel discussion. Thanks for having me. So first, let me start by saying that Commissioner Keller has been a true partner and leader in this work. Took it on, his staff. They've exhibited an extraordinary amount of time and effort to get to this point. And so from my perspective, planning a budget based on possible enrollment, and that's really what we have to do at this point in time. Our legislature currently funds the 50 community colleges on an allocation-based model. The community college sector gets X dollars, and then the 50 community colleges divide that X amount of dollars based primarily on enrollment in that given year. Then that funding remains with your college for the next 2 years, regardless if you grow or lose enrollment in that period of time. We then have to balance state appropriations with local taxes. And as a president who reports to a locally elected board, I can assure you that my board does not take tax increases lightly. We've raised taxes 4 times in the last 17 years. And we also have to balance those 2 revenue streams with tuition and fees. And we want to ensure that we remain affordable for the students that we serve. It's a key piece of that. And from my perspective, this is a historic opportunity to transition from a funding model that is static and merely redivides the same amount of resources, the same pie, if you will, for community colleges, to one that provides colleges with predictive funding based on outcomes. And so from that allows me to plan accordingly for what the needs of our respective community is.
Thanks so much. And I had a follow-up question, but you already answered it. So thanks so much. You must have read my mind. I wanted to move to Commissioner Keller and ask, in what ways do you feel the study results will be useful to state policymakers working to improve the way Texas funds its community colleges?
So I think 2 ways. So first, we're about to release our report, but we're already in the process of constructing, refining models that are going to inform the development of the legislation and the budget writers, and we're working very closely with the community college leadership, with William Serrata and his colleagues are great partners with us in that. And so we want to make sure that our recommendations are not only for a system that would be focused on outcomes, a system that would be dynamic, but also a system that would be equitable and that would be grounded in evidence. And so even these early analyses, even though that you're sort of looking in the rearview mirror here at the production of sort of state averages of success points, we're looking to optimize a little bit different set of outcomes, but that still gives us some important guidance about where there need to be weights in a new system, where there need to be adjustments, what the magnitude of those need to look like. And I think it's still a useful validation tool, even in its current form. What I'm hoping that we can do then is continue to build on this work, both overall, so that we can continue to develop a model that we could use as a validation tool to help us check the equity of the system overall, make sure we're not systematically disadvantaging colleges that serve first-generation students, low-income students, adult students, make sure that we're taking care of our smaller schools appropriately. But also then we can bring that in, I think we can bring that into focus at even more granular levels to understand what the costs are for the different pathways that students have to navigate through their program. So I'm very excited about this work, not as an endpoint, but as a jumping off point to a new generation of community college state finance policy.
Thank you. So I have one follow-up question for you, because obviously you've shared with us how the report results have been useful, and how they very well might be used in your policy development moving forward. What questions or issues do you think would require further study to inform policy? Is there anything that really
Yeah.
is there anywhere where the field needs to go to move into questions that need answering that clearly we haven't answered yet here?
Well, I think digging a little more, especially as we have more robust data available through working closely with the colleges on what's happening in workforce programs, where we can have pretty dramatic differences in the cost of different kinds of workforce programs. I think getting a little more granular sense of what the costs are in some of those workforce programs versus some of the transfer programs could be important. So I think this is kind of this is a good initial step that gives us a sense of like, what are those additional costs that we would associate generally, say, with the first generation students or students who are low income. I suspect that there's pretty different cost environments around the workforce programs versus some of the academic transfer programs, and would love to help facilitate sort of deeper dives into those questions.
Thanks so much. Very helpful. I'm going to move to Martha Snyder now. And my question for you is, to what extent are other states facing similar issues as Texas surrounding funding policy for community colleges?
Yeah, and I would say, in response to that, all of them are. Some of them might not know that they are, but they certainly are facing issues related to community college finance. But really, in all seriousness, I think it is a front and center issue that many states are grappling with, similar and facing similar challenges and discussions than what we saw in the Texas Commission work, and certainly the issues that are elevated through the study that you walked through. And I think that the value that adds to the field. We see states grappling with knowing that student success is kind of the core of what they want to get out of community colleges. They know that they want to have better access for underserved student populations, and they take steps to try and align their funding models with that. But oftentimes it's kind of absent the empirical evidence that is needed to really inform and drive policy. And again, I think that is certainly a role that this study, as Harrison kind of noted, right? It's kind of a first step to be a little bit more nuanced in our analysis of needs, and really build a more adequate and student-centered, resourced, equity-based finance environment for community colleges. So I think, again, states are kind of grappling with these issues. Much of it has been kind of based on conceptual understanding of the challenges facing community colleges and the students they serve, and less on that empirically derived evidence. And again, this is, I think, a process or a step in the right direction. I also just want to build on something that I think Harrison noted in terms of, understanding that these students have particular needs is very important. Who those students are, the additional costs necessary with that, but also connecting that ultimately to the pathways that students take, and what are the effective pathways that students can take, and the cost of those pathways, as well as a differential between different types of programs, be it workforce or transfer based. And again, I think that is where the field would like to go, but just want to kind of double down on Harrison's statement there.
Thank you so much. Extremely helpful. I'm going to move to Rick next, and I'm going to ask you, Rick, how might the findings offered by this new line of research inform the national policy debate on community college funding?
I think it's going to change the policy debate a great deal. So this is the first comprehensive attempt to quantify the cost of community college education. So to my mind, it's a huge leap forward. It's really important for Texas, but nationally, it shows that this can be done, and that we ought to be factoring in need in particular quantifiable ways. I mean, I think everyone in education has an intuitive sense that if you have a large percentage of first generation students or older students, that might cost more. But to my knowledge, this is the first time anyone has has quantified it with great precision. And I think that's going to have a big impact nationally. In the future, I think there are a couple of ways to possibly extend this research to make it even more ambitious. I mean, the study focused, first of all, on the costs within the community college sector, which is enormously important. But in the future, it may be that researchers will want to look at what's the cost of an adequate education for students at UT Austin or other four-year institutions. Politically, that may be a little tough because it may be that UT Austin doesn't want that comparison to be made, but I think it's an important thing to do. And the second area is in the future, researchers may want to raise the bar on what's considered an adequate outcome. As Bruce said, this study isn't looking at adequacy per se, it's looking at what it would take to get the statewide average for success points. And it's my understanding the completion rate for first-time, full-time students in Texas community colleges a couple of years ago at least was 23% after 3 years and 37% after 6 years, which is consistent with a lot of the national experience. But what about asking the question, what would it take to, what sort of resources would be needed to get to 50% completion? I think that's another thing that that researchers might want to look into. But my point here is really that you've started the ball rolling, and now people will not be able to ignore this issue in the way they have in the past.
Thanks so much. I'm gonna round this out and ask my colleague Bruce Baker a question, and it's kind of a lightning question for you, Bruce. What are the 3 most important takeaways that those listening need to bring home and understand? You're muted, Bruce.
Boil it down to 2. One, that these kinds of empirical methods can be used. And Harrison, for example, brought up the idea that they're going to be reshaping the types of outcomes they're interested in looking at. Well, we can then gather that data and roll it back into the model and estimate it. Also, that both Harrison and Martha brought up this issue of greater granularity of bringing it down to the cost of pathways through to completion of specific programs, and we can extend it to that finer granularity. The method can be used to inform policy in higher ed. And the second part of that's really just an extension of the first, is that it can produce the type of information that is directly actionable in the design of policy, right? So it's not, some kind of broad theoretical premise. We're able to use a method driven by the data on the system as it exists and applied to the outcomes we did or the outcomes we'd prefer to at a higher or lower level of granularity. And we can ideally directly inform the design of a funding formula that can be implemented and subsequently studied to see if it's getting the job done that we intended it to. So that I think is the takeaway here. It can be done, and it can directly and straightforwardly influence policy.
Very good. Thanks. I want to go back and I want to allow William and Martha actually to respond to a question. What further types of question would policy benefit from? What should us as researchers, what should we focus on next? In addition to, we heard that expanding this line of research is very, very important. And I think, Martha, you said almost all states are really experiencing very similar issues. So we got that message loud and clear, but what other things should we be looking at? Where should we be taking this research?
Sure, I want to give you an opportunity for Dr. Serrata to jump in first. I'm happy to go ahead.
So no, thank you. So I'll be brief. So 2 things come to mind from my perspective immediately. First, the economic impact of increased completion measures. based on increased state funding. And I noticed in the research, it indicated that an associate degree recipients earn on average about $8,500 more per year than a high school graduate. So what would be the return on investment for the state if the legislature strategically increased funding to community colleges? My simple math indicates that the current number of associate degrees produced annually by the 50 community colleges generates over $750 million in additional annual income for those community college graduates. So I think that that would be an important piece, again, a fact-based piece to encourage investment in these particular areas. I'd like to see additional research on the efficacy and effectiveness of dual credit programs offered by community colleges. I noticed that the report indicated that the only student need factor that was statistically significant and positively related to success points milestones was the percentage of students who are enrolled in dual credit programs. I believe that we need to ensure that our dual credit programs are offering dual credit with a purpose, so to speak, not just random dual credit courses, but dual credit with a purpose. But I also believe that we could mitigate some of the challenges that were identified in the research by strategically increasing the number of students who partake in dual credit with a purpose.
Right. So just to kind of, maybe take it in a slightly different direction, though want to acknowledge everything that Dr. Estrada said, I certainly agree with. One is, I think that we're talking right now about the kind of state level, macro level, what does it take to produce these outcomes? What are the gaps in outcomes, and how can funding, account for that? I think the next layer down then is better understanding, and I referenced this a little bit earlier, what are those strategies, those evidence-based strategies that actually lead to success, and how can state policy reinforce that, and the use kind of that institution spending for first-gen students, for academic underprepared students, and the costs associated with that. Certainly there's evidence on what those practices might be, but really costing out the kind of the pathways that those students take, and the resources or supports that they're receiving, and what the most effective application of that is, I think, is one next layer of that. And I know there's some research going on. My colleagues are involved in that with CCRC to try and assess some of that work. The other piece of it, I think, is to recognize, again, that there is kind of a broader ecosystem of revenue that community colleges are responding to, and that the state policy and state funding is one of those revenue sources. And so taking a broader lens of the revenue sources that community colleges are responding to, the incentives built within those, and how can state policy then kind of help create a more cohesive funding environment for community colleges to be focused on and be able to invest in student supports, student success, and ultimately achieve equity. And again, I think that's another place where the field is going. It's kind of corollary to the CCR work that that my colleagues are involved in.
Thanks so much. All right, I want to thank our panelists here, but they're not off the hook yet. I want to encourage all those listening in and watching the presentations to type in your questions. Please type them into the chat box if you can, and you can direct them. You can have the luxury of directing them to any and all of the panelists here. And I'm gonna see.
You've been asked if there's a link to the simulator available.
There's not a link to the simulator that's currently available, but it is available upon request. So if you contact us, we will be happy to make it available. There's a question here that says, how does tuition revenue fit into this funding picture? I guess I'll direct that to you, Bruce, first, and you could pass it off to others
I can
after.
pass it off pretty quickly, but Martha actually already raised this question. We're talking in our modeling about what are the costs to get to these certain outcomes, but the funding that gets kind of summed up to get to those costs comes from local tax source, tuition revenue, and state allocations, right? So the real trick is to figure out how to build a model that then combines these revenue sources to hit those expenditure targets. K-12 has thought about it that way, but doesn't have the tricky tuition piece in it. higher ed has not necessarily thought about it in those terms yet, but may start to. And I think that kicks it over to Harrison and or Martha. Harrison, maybe first.
Yeah, so just to pick up on Bruce's point, so overall, I mentioned that you know, the state share of community college funding in Texas, say it's about 25%, but the mix for individual colleges varies a lot. So we have we don't have an equalized system and for community colleges the way we do on K-12. So we have community colleges where 1 penny of tax effort per full-time student equivalent translates into $1,100. And we've got a college where 1 penny of tax effort per full-time student equivalent translates into $11, right? We've not equalized that funding. So that, again, that's why that our commission recommended introducing a guaranteed yield so we'd have a more equitable system. And when we're working on a funding model, we are making some assumptions about, well, what's reasonable to assume in terms of, think of it like tax effort and also tuition effort that would be part of a combined local effort that you'd want built into an equalized model. So again, this is sort of breaking new ground, as Bruce suggests, drawing on some of the insights and techniques from K-12 finance, but applying it in this new context.
Thank you so much. And I think that's really important to understand. In K-12, we really talk about, you know, equity for whom. And it's not just about equity for students and their families. It's also about equity for the taxpayers, right?
And
Bruce, do you want to say something?
The design of the formula is that we estimate these cost targets to get equal opportunity to common outcomes. And then so we want to allocate funding in a way that's adjusted for those costs and needs, but then accounts for what percent might be fairly paid by the locals, kind of what percent of the cost target, and then how much is allocated in state aid. And Harrison laid out those two pieces that we have to equalize for, you know, differences in ability to pay tuition and the differences in ability to raise local taxes have to be a piece of that puzzle. So.
Thanks so much. Here's another question. I'm going to do a lightning round on this one. So I want each of you to give your best answer. What surprised you in the research findings? And we're going to start with Rick.
You'd think after 2.5 years of Zoom, I could get to the mute button quickly. But sorry about that. I was very interested in the weights that are needed to provide equal opportunity, and it surprised me that the single biggest need factor was being over age 24. I thought first generation that made sense to me, and it was just a little bit below that. But that was surprising to me.
Great. Let's go next to Harrison.
Yeah, well, I'm actually going to underline Rick's point. One of the big things that was surprising for me. I mean, I expected to see something in this order of magnitude for students who are low income or first generation students, but I was really struck by these initial findings around the adult learners.
Thank you. I'm going to go next. William, what surprised you?
Yeah, I hate to be an echo, but I think that the adult learner, they're not only hard to reach in our respective communities, but the fact that was the overwhelming factor was incredibly surprising. So it not only shows the effort that we're going to have to put into reaching that particular student, but then the resources that we're going to have to ensure that those students have available to them to ensure their success. In particular with the data that Dr. Keller presented with regards to number of well over 60% of jobs that will require some post-secondary education or training.
Thank you. Okay, Martha, you're up.
I feel like I have to come up with something creative.
If
I went first, that would have been my answer, would have been the adult population, I think is surprised in terms of the magnitude that, as Dr. Estrada noted, certainly, they're hard to reach population, and they oftentimes those adult students oftentimes come with other needs, and balancing life more than, a traditional age student might be. That being said, the magnitude of that, but to maybe get a little creative, I think recognizing the basis of the analysis that we're talking about, the average of, achieving the average statewide for success points. I was actually somewhat surprised by how not far off the institutions are from that kind of adequate funding level or equitable funding level. You think of these conversations, and again, recognizing this is not a full adequacy study, but that is oftentimes a scary endeavor for policymakers to undertake, is to really, what does it actually cost to achieve success, and how far off are we? And recognizing that, 14% is still a big gap, but perhaps not the magnitude that some of us would have expected.
Thank you so much. Okay, Bruce, you're going to get the last word here. What was surprising to you as the researcher? And make it quick, please.
And to an extent, those same two things, but you know this as well as I do, when you go into estimating these models and gathering the data needed to estimate these models, you realize that you just don't know what the heck's going to come out the other end. So I guess nothing in that sense really surprised me, but that the adequacy gaps aren't so huge, and that older students was the big factor are a little surprising, but you just never know, because it's driven by what come through with the data that are available. So nothing really.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you so much. We're gonna wrap this up, but I really want to encourage all of the people listening to provide some feedback. We have a feedback survey. I think we've just put it in the chat box. Please take a moment to complete it. It's really important for us to get your feedback in order to improve our game. And let us know, if this event was valuable to you and how we can improve. With that, I want to thank our speakers and panelists for an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. I want to thank all you people who attended, took time out of your busy schedules to attend. We hope that you found the presentations made worthwhile and relevant for all the great work that you're doing to ensure that community colleges are funded both adequately and equitably. Last plug, also check out what's new with REL Southwest at our website. Our website has overviews of all the studies, infographics, videos, and of course published reports. And I think that is it. Please give us some feedback if you will, and thank you again for coming.